Hey, calling Chris Anderson in London.
Hey, this is London calling Rick Beyer in Chicago.
Oh, we're here in the twin studios of History Happy Hour, the
Scanning the globe.
broad history empire that we are part of, and we want to welcome everybody to another exciting edition of History Happy Hour every Sunday at 4 p.m. Chris, how many History Happy Hours?
This is in fact our 20th History Happy Hour. Never
No,
thought.
okay.
What?
This is our 20th History Happy Hour?
20th.
Oh my God.
Yes, the anniversary. It's just going to be a few weeks. We'll do this show and everything will be back to normal again. So
yeah, so now we're into 20 weeks. So what is the appropriate gift for 20 or 20th? It's our 20th anniversary, Chris.
Well, apparently you're supposed to send me something in platinum.
So I don't have my wallet. I could send you my American Express Platinum card. If
There
that
you
would
go.
That's
which is no longer effective.
Gift. So we have some folks joining us here, and we want to just say hello to John and Nancy and Ken and anybody, Doreen, anybody who's joining us. Please sign in and let us know you're here. Let us know where you're from. And who else we got, Chris? We have
Jack and Jean.
And silver. I'm not giving Chris anything silver. I'm sorry. That is not happening.
Can I mention something very important before my wife gets on because she won't let me mention it?
Yes.
Do you know what happened yesterday? Very important.
Okay. A lot of things happened yesterday.
But the most important thing that happened yesterday.
Okay. What is it?
Arsenal Football Club won the FA Cup. There you go, Duncan. That one's for you.
Okay. That is some of the least exciting news I've gotten all year.
Awesome news.
So I just, as folks are joining us here, I just want to mention it's this day in history, Chris. So is Hannibal defeats the Romans this day. Yeah. The Carthaginians defeat the Romans at the Battle of Cannae. Am I saying that right?
Cannae, but I don't think the Romans are quite done with Hannibal. I'm going to take a guess there.
No, if I was betting, I would bet on the Romans for the rematch. That's in 216 BC. And in 1943, on this date, there was a boating accident in the Pacific.
There was. What happened?
Well, there's guys in a boat, and he's hit by another boat. They have to swim to shore, scrawl things on a coconut, get rescued.
Something like that could launch a political career.
You could. I believe that John Kennedy was once asked by a small boy, "How did you get to be a war hero?" And he said, "It was easy. They sank my boat."
They sank my battleship.
They sank my boat. So PT 109 today. So a couple of things in history. Okay, well, I think we have killed enough time here for people to join us. Mike and Patricia are with us. And Catherine says it's silver anniversary. We both have silver hair, so we're in great shape. And I think that is the cue then for us to get things going. And I'm sorry I cut you off.
They're back. Hannibal, I'm back.
The bar is open.
Bar is open. Congratulations.
And so we have a very appropriate topic today. Chris Anderson, tell us about our topic and our guest who is standing by.
I am very, very excited about both. Our topic today is George Washington, rum runner, bootlegger, and whiskey distiller extraordinaire. What makes it doubly special is our guest expert is my lovely wife, Anna. And hello, my lovely wife, Anna.
Hello.
Hi, Anna.
I just want to say that many, many years ago when Anna and I first met, she was an archaeologist and did some remarkable work at Mount Vernon. And in the process of some of her work, she did some research and was one of the first people to do research on George Washington's whiskey distillery and found out some fascinating things about our first president and wrote it up, and that in many ways led to Mount Vernon's efforts to recreate the whiskey distillery. And I've always been very proud of the work she did and found it very, very fascinating. So I thought, what better way to celebrate our 20th episode than talking about whiskey?
Woot woot. And so,
Here.
yeah. So, Anna, what are you have a cocktail, appropriate cocktail for today?
Well, so we couldn't get any Virginia whiskey, so we have some Tennessee whiskey.
Yep.
Good old Jack Daniels with ginger ale.
All right. And Chris, you're the same there?
Oddly enough, yes.
All right. And I am the lone holdout drinking the Scottish whiskey.
But you good for holding up the flag.
Going for well, there is a Scottish connection to this story as well, so I feel pretty good. Anna, welcome to History Happy Hour, and Anna joins us from the London studio. In case you were all wondering,
the lower level of the London studio.
It's a 2-level studio in London. Chris, you want to start us off?
Yeah. So, other than just brightening us with your presence, what was the thing? Well, tell us a little bit about Washington's distillery and maybe what we knew about it before you did your work and before the archaeological dig and kind of what your work led to.
Okay. So very little was actually known about Washington's distillery before I did the research. It was known that he had one. And it was thought that he was just distilling crop overage to prevent it from just rotting, sort of turning it into a more useful product that he could use on any one of his 5 farms that made up Mount Vernon plantation. And it was sort of that way for a very long time. George Washington was long considered gentleman farmer. He was, like many other plantation owners at the time, he was innovative in a number of his agricultural practices and trying to move away from tobacco for a number of reasons and diversifying his crops. And many plantations, there he is.
Ask me a drink.
There he is.
That's him.
Yes, that's him. And he worked hard at diversifying his plantation. He had a number of sort of, I guess we would refer to them as cottage industries that initially were set up to, like the blacksmith shop. It was initially set up to serve the needs of the plantation, but then also his neighbors, sort of in a 5-mile radius catchment area. But then the needs of the plantation outgrew what he could provide to his neighbors. So that became just something that he did to keep everything running on his farms. He had other ventures. He had fisheries. And again, that was something that started as a way for him to feed the hundreds of slaves and the overseers and the family members and everyone else who made the plantation run. But he did find that there was overage. He had 5 fisheries along the river. And he found there was overage. So that was something that he started to then sell to his neighbors, but then also that he consigned in Alexandria, Virginia, which was the closest metropolitan area to Mount Vernon. So he had this sort of hybrid. Frankly, it started off as sort of a selfish venture, right? I'm going to find an easy way to feed everybody on this massive 8,000-acre plantation. But then kind of found that it was like, wow, this is just easy pickings, shooting fish in a barrel. So he had all this extra fish, and it became a financial venture as well. People long knew that he had a distillery. It was next to a grist mill. The first grist mill that he had was quickly deemed to be too small. He ground his own grains and sold flour up and down the eastern seaboard into the Caribbean and into Europe. And the need was so great that he needed a larger mill that had a larger mill race and a better water source. So he moved it to where the grist mill is now, which, if you are visiting Mount Vernon as it stands today, is probably about a mile walk. So the mansion is that red dot. And then over there by Woodlawn on the far left side of the screen, you can see distillery, and that's grist mill. So that's where it's located. It's just a short.
Really good eyes to see that. Really good eyes, but
it's just a short drive. It's there. It's there.
So when you started doing the digging for the distillery, did you know where it was, or did you guys have to find it?
No. We knew where it was when he built the new grist mill, so that he could produce a wide variety of flours, and it gave him this capacity to grind not only his own grains, but neighbors' grains, and then buy grain from his neighbors to grind into flour and sell under his own seal. That was the logical place to put the distillery because they require the same resources. So the distillery originally started in 1797 when his farm manager, a Scotsman named James Anderson,
no relation,
arrived.
Oh no, suddenly the whole thing is becoming clear. I see. This is the aggrandizement of the Anderson clan. I've been ambushed by Anderson.
I wish it were. I wish there were a connection.
No connection.
Oh, we don't know if there's a connection. Oh, sure.
No connection. No kickbacks for us. So his farm manager, being a Scotsman who was a distiller in Scotland, arrived and immediately set about talking George Washington into setting up a distillery next to the grist mill. Washington agreed. He was a little bit hesitant, and there are many letters in which he acknowledges that this is something that I know nothing about. Like fishing, I know something about. Blacksmithing, milling grain. These are all things I know something about. But I can drink it, but I don't know how you make it, and I don't know how expensive it's going to be to make it, and I don't know what risk is going to be involved and what materials you're going to require. So I'm putting my trust in you.
So Anna, so it's kind of interesting. He's still president in early 1797, if my date memories are correct. He's going to be president till March. He's hired James Anderson. So why, if he's so nervous about it and kind of hesitant about it, why is he willing to go ahead and make what ends up being a pretty big distillery? I mean, do you have any idea, even a thought about it?
Yeah. So the speculation is that he was getting old and he was tired, and he just wanted to. It was known that he just wanted to go back home. He just wanted to be a farmer. He didn't want to be a general. He didn't want to be the president. He just wanted to close the cover on that part of his life and get back to what he truly loved, which was
bring the hammock by the archers at Mount Vernon there. And
yeah, that's exactly what he wanted to do.
He wanted to sit under his own vine and fig tree, I think.
Yeah.
That's exactly it. But he just wanted to get back to, the way things were. And at the same time, he also realized that he was getting older and things were changing. And certainly the relationship that the now fledgling United States had with Britain was different than it was in the 1760s. And so commerce and trade was different. And so he was also trying to pivot, I think, into a way to capitalize on what the plantation could do. And the distillery, while he had some hesitation and he had some small anxiety about it, there are also many accounts in his letters. He was a prolific letter writer, and everything got saved. The archives at Mount Vernon are amazing in that regard. But there are a number of letters that he wrote to folks where he was sort of expressing hope and excitement at this new venture. And, maybe this will be, we'll see how it goes. I'm kind of excited to see how it turns out. So the distillery started at the grist mill. It was started in the cooperage building, which is a cooperage shed. And it was a small distillery. It was just 2 stills. And that was in January 1797. The first batch, I have notes. I'm sorry. That's why I'm looking down. Lots of dates and numbers in this thing. At late February 1797, the first batch of whiskey was produced in the 2 still cooperage cottage by the distillery. In March, George leaves the presidency and he returns to Mount Vernon. And in the ensuing months between February and October, Anderson convinces him, and rightly so, by just showing him some of the facts and figures that are in the distillery ledger, that we can make a lot more. The demand is very high, and 2 stills aren't getting it done. You need to build a purpose-built building that has more than 2 stills that can accommodate the demand. And so in October 1797, he built a large stone building, which I have a picture. Ta-da!
Slide.
That's the distillery as it stands today at Mount Vernon. It contains 5 stills, and
wow.
It is a large building. It is 75 feet by 30 feet, which is 2,250 square feet. Your average distillery in the 1790s was only 800 square feet. So it's a massive operation.
So, honey,
go ahead, Chris.
No, I just want to kind of like back up just a bit.
Yep.
Obviously, maybe you would know, but was he aware of the huge market for his produce? And so people have a better understanding. What was the market in early America? I mean, were we drinkers? Were we not drinkers? And was he kind of tapping into something there?
Yeah, so America was a land of drunkards. People drank a lot. I mean, people think people today drink a lot, and they would not have survived in the 18th century. Colonies / America, people drank a lot. They drank some kind of alcoholic beverage all day long. That's just what they did.
They drank a lot of rum, didn't they?
They did drink a lot of rum. So that was a drink that was very popular before the American Revolution because of the fact that they were able to get the molasses and the molasses from the West Indies, and they could process that up and down the East Coast, primarily in New England. But during and after the American Revolution, it fell out of favor. Obviously, people still drank rum. It was still available, and people still drank it. But it fell out of favor because it became a drink that was strongly associated with Britain, which, of course, during the American Revolution,
yeah, we can't have that.
We're good guys. Good guys.
Super fond of. And it also became more expensive because trade routes had been stopped because of the blockade. And then also the West Indies, where the molasses comes from. That's the primary ingredient in rum. The molasses plantations in the West Indies also sort of cottoned onto the fact that, wait, we can actually make the rum ourselves and sell that and make more money instead of just selling the raw materials to somebody else to make. So a lot of the sugar plantations in West Indies switched to also incorporate their own distilling. So they still sold the molasses on, but they also sold the rum. So in a nation of people who really don't drink anything except alcohol, in some form or another, there was a need to find something else. Whiskey had always been a thing. It had always been present in the colonies. It was widely considered sort of a seasonal alcohol because it would be distilled at the end of the harvest season. You would harvest all of your grains, you would mill into flour, and then there would be overage, and that would be distilled because grain rots, but alcohol does not.
So you were saying in your thesis, honey, that I want to make sure I get this right. But at the time Washington starts his distillery, the average yearly consumption for every American was 4 or 4.5 gallons.
Yes.
Of distilled spirits.
Yes, a year.
A year.
And I want to just throw in on the subject of colonial drinking, since we're dumping on our forebears here, a couple of things. Which is one, I did hear a great quote about water. Well, water is good for navigation. And I also I found a letter that Ben Franklin wrote in 1787, in which he is extolling the importance of the elbow, and the fact that what's great about the fact that we have an elbow is our elbow is positioned in such a way that we are able to raise a wine glass to our lips, and that this is something that humans have that animals don't. And he even includes some drawings in his letter to demonstrate.
Progress, damn it, progress.
This is Ben Franklin drawings here about, and his last line of the letter. Well, it's in French, but I'll go with the English translation. He says, "Let us then, with glass in hand, adore this benevolent wisdom." That is putting the elbow there. Let us adore and drink. So clearly,
Okay.
I think yeah, that's almost as good as mentioning a ghost army. So clearly it's a big drinking time. So we're there's a sort of a switch over to whiskey that's going on. And I always think it's interesting how things like, if somebody now was drinking coffee instead of tea or whiskey instead of rum, it's considered a matter of taste. And yet that taste is almost always determined by economics, politics, trade routes, sort of the rise and fall of businesses. And it's shaped and molded. But so whiskey becomes more important, and Washington's part of that. And we have a question, and we do welcome questions from our audience. Please let us know if you have a question, type it in. We do have a question. Weren't there a lot of small whiskey operations at that time, especially where there were Scottish settlers? And I would add into that, you've already alluded to this, but how does Washington's distillery differ from that? I think I saw a figure possibly in your thesis or possibly in the book Alcoholic Republic that 1 out of 30 farms had a distillery. If there's so many distilleries, how does Washington stand out? Is it size or what?
Right. So yes, to answer the first question, yes, there were a lot of small still operations, and whether there were Scots there or not, it was just a very common thing on farms. But the difference is that they were seasonal. They didn't operate year round. George Washington's whiskey distillery, his most prolific year was 1799, which was the year that he died. I actually have some really great numbers here to share. So in 1797, when he had his small little 2-still distillery in the cooperage shed, he distilled approximately 650 gallons of whiskey. In 1798, he distilled 4,320 gallons of whiskey, and he got really hopping in his 5-still distillery in 1799, and with 10,000 gallons of whiskey in a year. And then he, of course, died in December 1799. And in 1800, the ledger I reviewed and analyzed continued into 1800. The distillery still produced 400 gallons of whiskey, but that was in the very, very early part of 1800. It was like January and February, and they were clearly just selling off what had been made while Washington was still alive. So between 1797 and 1798, it was a 7 times increase in volume of whiskey made. From 1798 to 1799, it was 2.25 times of an increase. And then after he died, it was 25.5 times decrease. So Washington's whiskey distillery with 5 stills was a massive commercial operation. This is something that nobody really thought he did. They, for many, 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 many years, really since forever, everybody sort of believed the myth, not necessarily the myth, but sort of the story, the legend that George Washington was this gentleman farmer, and everything he did was with, ease and grace and kindness, and he never lied, and he, all sort of the myth that surrounds George Washington. And certainly no one was thinking that he was like, how can I make a pile of money? And that is what the distillery did. And by diving into the farm ledger that was the subject of my thesis, it really sort of pulled the curtain back on how much of a commercial interest the distillery was. I actually translated some of the amounts of money that he made into modern dollars, which I think is always kind of fun to sort of have a sense of what things are worth. So 1799 was the year with the highest production. And so the nearly 10,000 gallons of whiskey were valued at $7,675 in 1799 dollars, which, if the little converter engine that I found on Google is correct, equals.
It certainly is.
Of course. Uncle Google will never steer us wrong.
Google never lies.
Equals approximately $161,000.
So that's a pretty good.
That's a good haul.
Well, so I was looking at the thesis, and I mean, just to give people a comparison, in your thesis, you talk about the Brown family,
yes,
famous for slavery, sugar, and a little university up in Rhode Island. And what was they were producing? And another distillery were producing not even as much whiskey as what was Washington produced, right? They were producing something like 10,000 gallons, but it was all the big distillers in Rhode Island.
Right. So there were two major distillers in Rhode Island. And at the same time that George Washington was producing 10,000 gallons of whiskey, these two distilleries combined were producing 10,000 gallons of rum.
So Washington is one of the largest alcohol manufacturers in America.
Yes. In fact, there was a survey done by Colonial Williamsburg of various industries throughout sort of colonial world, colonial America. And during the same time frame that George Washington was operating his distillery, 1797 to 1799, his was the largest distillery in colonial America and early United States, not just before the Revolution. But
so it says something about Washington, that something that he doesn't know a lot about, that he's kind of new to.
Right. It's
jumping in with both feet, man.
It was very entrepreneurial, and it was a bit of a leap of faith. And he did do due diligence on it, though. He wrote a number of letters to friends and trusted advisors who either were rum distillers or were familiar with the distilling process, maybe whiskey, maybe rum, and asked them straight up, is this worth it, or will I just be throwing good money after bad? And they all wrote back with, no, this
brew on. 2 thumbs up.
Good plan. Do you think? I mean, I sort of put this to Chris. I mean, I think that it strikes me that there's many times when Washington is a bit of a risk taker in battle. He's bluffing the British when they're putting the arming Dorchester Heights. He doesn't really have any ammunition. He goes into battle a number of times when the chances don't look great and people think maybe he shouldn't be doing it, and it doesn't always work out. But it seems like he's pretty consistently somebody who's willing to go say, well, okay, I'll give it a shot. So I want to ask Anna a question, if it's okay, Chris, for me to talk a little in this one.
Yes.
I did. Yeah. We did get a question here. How many guests before today have been called honey on the show? And so we're going to look back in the previous shows.
I call Rick honey all the time after the show's over.
We're going to look back into the previous shows and try to answer that question. But Anna, I'm really interested in the ledger. So there you are. You are a graduate student at William and Mary. You are a person with archaeology experience. You are the first person, if I have this correctly, to transcribe and analyze the data from this particular ledger, which tells the story of Washington's distillery. And it changes, as we've discussed, kind of our understanding of Washington, because he's not a gentleman farmer. He's an entrepreneur. He's an innovator. He's kind of a small-scale industrialist in all of this. So how did you latch on to this? And was it because why had nobody else done this? How did you happen to do it? And was it one of those moments where you're like, holy moly, I think I'm the first one here. I think this is really going to change what people think.
Right. So it was kind of a combination of factors. When I was in graduate school at William & Mary, I was sort of trolling around for a topic for my thesis. And lots of things seemed interesting, but nothing was really sticking. And I had worked at Mount Vernon on and off over several years as an archaeologist, and was very friendly with the chief archaeologist and the assistant archaeologist, and would often speak with them about my thesis and what could I do and any ideas, any thoughts. And they're like, well, we're going to be doing this big work on the distillery. It's a big push, sort of seeing what we can find, blah, blah, blah. Why don't you go talk to the head librarian up in the archives and see, because any research you do would be really helpful to us.
Sure.
So it would help you and it would help us. It's a win-win. So I went up and I had a conversation with the head librarian, and she's like, oh, well, we do have these 2 farm ledgers. So George Washington had farm ledgers, and they're these handwritten exactly like that. And they track every transaction that occurs on the plantation. Some of them are divided by farm, some of them are divided by industry, most of them are by year, and it is a full accounting of what happened at Mount Vernon. So I was looking at the 1797 to 1801 farm ledger, because that one had not ever been transcribed. It had only, so this was way back in the early 2000s. It had only just recently been put onto microfilm, and had then at that point become a real usable resource. But nobody had ever looked at it more than just acknowledging that the ledger existed. So I start going through it and realized pretty early on that, wow, this is all completely just about the distillery, about all the economic activity that happened at the distillery. It is an amazing snapshot in time of the relationships that George Washington had, both with his neighbors and with merchants in Alexandria, and not just the whiskey. A convenient byproduct of distilling is livestock, because there's nothing better than pigs to eat all the waste from the distillery. So at the distillery, he also had a pen that had up to 150 hogs in it at any one time.
Happy pigs make yummy bacon.
Yes, all very well fed. And so as I started to sort of just look through the pages of the ledger, I was like, wow, this can really tell a story. And it's a story that nobody has ever told before. My degree is in anthropology with a focus on historical archaeology. So I had to set the ledger somehow into a cultural anthropological framework. That part was really hard for me because I really just wanted to dive into the data in the ledger and just start telling the story that the ledger had to tell, and not.
That's the part of the thesis I skipped over.
Yeah, that's the part of the thesis I skipped over too. That was not my favorite part.
Tell your thesis
that was the hardest part to write. That was hands down the hardest part to write, and the hardest part to defend, and all of that. But it was, I think it just tells a really amazing story about George Washington. And it really, I mean, it's really kind of sad that he died in December 1799, because I think that he would have found the distillery to be an operation, a portion of his plantation that would have continued to make him large sums of money with little to no effort on his part. James Anderson's son, John Anderson, was actually the person who was in charge of the distillery on the day-to-day basis. And there were no more than 6 slaves who worked in the distillery. So you got 7 maximum people working there. And at the end of 1799, when they balanced the book, they had a profit of $1,850 which translates to about $38,750 $2020. So that includes, I mean, that's a huge amount of profit for not really doing anything. I mean, that covers all the extra grain that George Washington had to buy, because the distillery became a grain-eating beast. I mean, he did not grow enough grain to be able to feed the distillery. So he was going around and buying up grain from all of his neighbors, family members, plantations, within a reasonable distance, but more than 5 miles outside of the catchment area, in order to be able to distill the volume of whiskey that there was a market for.
Well, I mean, that's one of the things that I found really interesting was you talked a little bit about kind of closed communities and open communities. Closed communities being very self-sufficient, and we're yeoman farmers and we grow what we eat and produce what we need and all this stuff. And then there's those grubby capitalists who go out and have access to the wider economic market, and they're kind of at the whims of that. And what you found in the ledger says that Washington is kind of bridging that gap, and he's going out into the world, which is not the image that you have of these plantations and these plantation owners. I mean, Washington is selling all over the world.
Yeah, I mean, definitely the times were changing, and I think Washington he was not alone. Many plantation owners were seeing the writing on the wall that we're going to need to evolve and change. And the way he did that was he started to develop more industry. The distillery was the biggest thing to sort of, maybe I don't need to be such a big planter. Maybe I can do other things. Maybe I can do things that don't require so much manpower, which reduces my overhead, right? And it was definitely a period of transition, and it's unfortunate, I'm sure for many, many reasons. It's unfortunate that George Washington died in 1799. But from the point of view of the distillery, it really would have been interesting to see how it would have looked in 1805 or 1810, after it had been a going concern for 5, 6, 7, 8 years. Would it continue to basically double in production? I mean, that's impossible. At some point, it would have had to level out. But would it have leveled out at a level that would have made it so incredibly productive that he maybe would have been able to change other things on the plantation, maybe shed some of his acreage, maybe free his slaves, some of his slaves, maybe not all of his slaves. But it's a big question mark that we can only just hypothesize about.
So, right. So our kind of whole image of him might be different if he lived another 5 or 10 years. I mean,
yeah.
At least our, sort of our not our view of his presidency necessarily, or the man as a character, but his sort of the whole picture. But so anthropology and archaeology are great, but I really want to get into something of, I think, real interest to our audience, our happy hour audience here, which is what this whiskey was about, whether this stuff was any good. And I have reproduced a chart from your thesis, and I want to just tell our audience that if you go to the reading list on the History Happy Hour webpage at StephenAmbroseTours.com, we have a link that you can download Anna's thesis, and you can read the good parts and the other parts, and they're all good parts, and it's
all parts.
And it's very interesting. I mean, I found it very, very revealing. But there's this great chart, and I love this. So this is the kind of whiskey described that you gathered this data and you pulled it together into this chart. So the most of what he made was just whiskey. It's just described as whiskey. But then there's also these small batches of common, rectified fourth proof, which sounds really scary, whiskey strong proof, fine rectified whiskey, rye whiskey, and double distilled. So now it sounds like, my God, George Washington has a tasting menu of this incredible variety of whiskey. What do we know about what any of this stuff would have tasted like or been like to drink?
So I think it's pretty safe to assume that the whiskey, which was the most common at the whatever 13 or 11,000 gallons that it is, that was basically distilled, poured into a barrel, and sold. So it was as close to Everclear as you could get. It was not.
This isn't fine aged Glenmorangie.
No, none of this is fine aged. Even the rectified fourth proof or the double distilled, still not finely aged.
Rectified fourth proof sounds like something you drink in a secret ceremony where a portion of the drinkers may die from drinking the rectified fourth proof whiskey. It's just a great name for a band too. Rectified fourth proof.
Yes.
Band name.
Yes, band name. But what's interesting is George Washington, while he did not know a lot, and he learned, but he did not know a lot about distilling, he applied some of the things that he did know about milling that he had at his grist mill, that he then applied to the distillery. So he had several grades of flour. And it was very popular to have all these different flours for different things.
Sorry.
And so he applied that to the distillery. And he had these, 8 different kinds of whiskey. And they had different price points. They were sold at different times of the year. The most common was the whiskey. It sold most frequently. It sold for 59 cents a gallon,
Woo-hoo.
which is $12.37 a gallon in 2020 times. So
yeah, that's just how much I think I pay at Trader Joe's for.
But then the other ones, the common, the whiskey, the strong proof, and the rye whiskey, those were in a separate class. They were even more cheap than the actual whiskey. They sold for 56 cents to 58 cents a gallon. So that's $11.75 to $12.16 a gallon. Really cheap stuff.
Okay.
But then you had your high end, the rectified, the fine rectified, the rectified fourth proof and double distilled. Those sold for nearly $1 a gallon. Those sold for
He let that actually cool down before he sold it.
Yes. So those sold for the equivalent of almost $21 in 2020.
So, I wouldn't be me if I didn't, point out the hypocrisy that is George Washington. I just wanted to mention this quote here. Washington says, and I quote, "The ruin of half the workmen of this country is caused by alcohol," unquote. But yet he had no problem selling the cheapest rot gut whiskey he could find. Just thought I'd mention that, Rick.
Yes. What's interesting is that everything that is classified as something other than just whiskey is only available at certain times of the year. So that indicates that it is at least sitting in the barrel for anywhere from 2 to 6 months.
Oh.
So those would be only available in the spring or the fall.
Well, that kind of answers. So we did have a question from Catherine Hurst about would they have set any aside to age? So they apparently did. It aged a little bit. And we probably just don't know because the record's basically a stop with Washington's death because it's transferred to new ownership. We just don't really know if they would have, if he'd owned it longer, if he would have set some aside for a longer period of time.
Right. And that's the other thing that is sort of also a big hypothetical is if he had lived to, say, 1810 and the distillery had had a 12, 13, 14-year run, would he have had like a 10-year whiskey?
Well,
nobody knows.
We don't know. I want to bring in, we have a couple of questions from viewers, and I want to bring in one from Ted Moon here. And he wants to know, how did Washington market his whiskey, through distributors or direct under the GW brand, since everyone knew who he was? I cannot tell a lie, but I can sure make that rye.
Oh, very good.
I've used that one before. So anyway, what did he do? How did he market it?
So it was a combination of things. In the distillery ledger, there were about 220 individuals or businesses that conducted business with the plantation in the farm ledger. Of those, 57 dealt exclusively with the distillery. Of those, 20 were businesses. And the businesses were a wide range of businesses. There was one, Lawrence Hoff. He was a butcher in Alexandria. And while he did buy some whiskey from the distillery, he primarily bought livestock from the distillery, which was sort of an interesting offshoot from, it was, I think, an unexpected income stream that George Washington had not anticipated. But his biggest customer, to whom he sold a couple thousand gallons of whiskey over the course of 1799, was a merchant in Alexandria named George Gilpin. And he had a warehouse and wharf called Gilpin's Wharf. For those of you who are in Northern Virginia, it's at the southeast corner of Prince and Union Streets.
Okay. What you referred to previously as the metropolis of Alexandria.
Yes, the metropolis of Alexandria. Yes. And Gilpin was the in-town retail outlet for George Washington. They originally had an arrangement where George Washington would consign his whiskey via George Gilpin, and Gilpin would get a commission on all the whiskey that he sold. So it would mean that the people who lived in town or who lived north of Alexandria, which was too far to get to Mount Vernon and the distillery, they could still get Washington's whiskey without having to go all the way down to the distillery. But in about the middle of 1799, that relationship changed, and Gilpin started to buy whiskey from Washington wholesale. And then he sold it under his own label in smaller quantities. So it became a very different kind of economic relationship. So, and throughout this whole time, there were still people who were coming to the distillery, and they were buying 200 and 300 gallons of whiskey at a go, once a month, once every couple of months. They would pay cash for it. Party time. They'd pay cash for it, or they would barter for it. That was a very common way of getting the whiskey. I don't think anything was branded as we would know it today, right? So there's, Jack Daniels with the black label with the number 7 on it, or Maker's Mark, or anything like that.
Of course, they do it today, though, right? The distillery at Mount Vernon does sell. They still operate, and they do sell George Washington whiskey. I've seen the bottles online.
I don't think George Washington would recognize the whiskey that's produced at the distillery today.
No, he wouldn't, because what they sell today has been it's been allowed to sit for 3 years, aged for 3 years minimum.
Outrageous,
and they're selling it.
Accurate. It's upsetting.
It is not accurate. It is upsetting. And they're also selling it for almost $150 a bottle.
Yeah, which is
not a gallon size.
It's only about $10, so it's okay. And you said I seem to recall in your thesis, which I found was sort of quaint and interesting, was that at first Washington wanted the distillery to be near the mansion house so he could keep an eye on the disreputable characters who might show up to buy the whiskey.
Yes.
So he really is conflicted about this. He's conflicted about whether to do it. He's conflicted about whether it's a good idea. But as Nancy Nallen says, bottom line, this is all about building wealth.
Yes. Oh, 100%. Absolutely. I mean, I think that George Washington, even before the distillery, I think he was a man who was conflicted by many, many things. And this is just an extension of that. He was cautious, but he also was an entrepreneur and was willing to take risk. But I guess maybe they were calculated risks. Like he established the distillery after consulting with trusted friends, other people in the industry that he knew or were friends of people that he knew, and he got their opinion on it. And when they all said, yes, you should absolutely 100% do this, he threw his hat into the ring. He was still nervous about it. And he did remind James Anderson, at least on one occasion, that, you're supposed to give me those books quarterly so that I can look them over and sign off on them. And Anderson did, they did, Washington did, and there are several places in the farm ledger where he has attested to how much loss and profit, and signed off on it at the end of the quarter. So yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, it really was about making money.
Yes, as my friend Jim Lattin says, who's a business professor, the bottom line is that this is about the bottom line.
Yeah, that's exactly right. That's exactly right.
So, yeah. Chris, you got one more you want to ask, or we have one more we can bring in from a view.
Bring in one more, but then also maybe just kind of to wrap up the story, tell people what happened to the distillery and that great God-fearing Scottish gentleman, Mr. Anderson. No relation.
And we'll do a quick question before that. So that's the final question, and you can also answer. Did Washington pay tax on his whiskey? Because there was a whiskey tax. Some people were really unhappy about it. Yeah. Was Washington paying tax, or was he some sort of tax avoider?
No, he paid tax. He paid tax on his whiskey, and it appears in the ledger as a line item of the tax that he paid. He did not shirk that responsibility.
And so, how does the story?
1,000 gallons a year. It's kind of hard to hide it.
Well, that's exactly right. It's not like you can just throw a tarp over it in the woods of West Virginia. No distillery here.
Nothing to see here, folks. Go visit the Presidential Museum. So how does the story end? What happens to this distillery? What happens to James Anderson?
So Washington dies, and the distillery does continue. It gets passed on to his nephew. And then the bookkeeping ends. Mount Vernon doesn't have any record of what his nephew did. Certainly there was a period of time after Washington's death where there were still some entries made into the farm ledger. And it's just the bookkeeping is really shoddy in comparison to when Washington had the reins. And I believe it was by 1809, maybe it was 1810, but basically the building is abandoned and is starting to crumble and fall apart. So then you fast forward to 2002, 2003, and the archaeology department at Mount Vernon starts doing archaeology there, and they locate the foundation of the distillery. They identify where the 5 stills sat in the distillery. They identified where the water came in. Yeah, there you go. So you can see the mill race there and the water coming off of that in the wooden sluice. And it goes into the distillery, and that's used to make the whiskey. And now they do distill their own whiskey. You can buy it in the gift shop at Mount Vernon, apparently. Quite expensive. Don't know what it tastes like, but it is not what George Washington distilled. It has aged for at least 3 years. So it won't put hair on your chest.
Well,
and you can't strip paint with it.
Well, Anna Anderson, thank you so much for joining us here. We're lucky to have your expertise on this really great topic, and we've finally got a chance to talk about drinking on History Happy Hour, and we have another drinking episode coming up in October or November, so that'll be exciting too. And thanks so much for coming.
Well, thank you so much for having me. This was fun.
Good.
All right. Cheers. We're gonna say goodbye. Goodbye.
Bye.
There you go. And wow, that was fabulous, Chris.
Yeah.
And if you see our guest at any point later in the evenings, tell her that it was great. And you have a history happened here, I think, to share regarding George Washington. Tell us.
Well, as you know, George Washington doesn't receive a lot of play here in London, where I live. Can't imagine why. But the ever vigilant ladies, the daughters of the American Revolution, noticed a gaping hole in London statuary. So sometime in the 20s or 30s, I believe.
It's in the 20s, yeah.
They were kind enough to give us this statue of George. So this sits in Trafalgar Square, just up behind Lord Nelson, if you find yourself there in Trafalgar Square. George is looking away, but over his right shoulder, if he were looking the other way, he'd be looking about a block away is one of my favorite statues, which is the statue of George III. So I guess he's showing his disdain by looking off in the other direction.
I'm happy. This is how we know it was in 1921.
Oh, there you go.
To the people of Great Britain and Ireland. So fabulous. And I'm sure that all those people of Great Britain and Ireland appreciate that.
Every day they wake up in London and say thank you to the ladies of Virginia.
I wanted to, instead of the normal history joke of the week, I wanted to do a variation on that, which is over the course of the years, I've come across exactly 2 humorous remarks made by George Washington. And so I thought I would share jokes told by George Washington. It's a little short for a book, so I can't. I'm thinking I need at least 3 jokes to make a book out of it. But the first one is, as the story goes, crossing the Delaware in 1776, Christmas Day, and it's bitterly cold, and there's ice, and it's snow, and it's nasty, and they all think they're going to lose, and it's going to be horrible. And Washington is getting into the Durham boat, and Henry Knox, his commander of artillery, is sitting in there, who is a rather portly young man. Yeah. And as Washington steps into the boat, it is said that he nudges him with his foot and says, "Shift your fat ass, Harry, but slowly, or you'll swamp the damn boat." And this is supposedly then circulated among the men and sort of raised morale in their moment of difficulty there. So that's Howler number 1 from George Washington. I mean, that's and then the second one is when he visits Lexington. He visits the scene of the Battle of Lexington in 1789. He said the spot where blood was first spilt in the Revolution. Uh-huh. And somebody who was there with him reports that he related a story that Ben Franklin had told him. That Franklin, I guess probably when he was negotiating the Treaty of Paris, but he's in conversation with some British official who was expressing outrage at the unfair tactics of the Americans, at the Battle of Lexington, firing from behind stone walls. And Ben Franklin, as Washington told the story, Ben Franklin said, "Yes, but didn't the walls have 2 sides?" I mean, that is, whoo, George, you're knocking him dead, baby.
He's here all week.
I know, but he was president, so probably everybody laughed.
Oh, yes, they would. Yeah,
a loud laugh. And we gave George Washington writing credit on the history jokes of the week. What is up next week, Chris, we have our very first return engagement of a guest.
Yes, well, back by popular demand, we're going to have the wonderful Don Farrell back to talk about the actual mission to drop the atomic bombs on Japan. Last time Don showed on the show, we had so many questions about the invasion on Saipan and Tinian, we didn't quite get
there, right?
Right. So he has agreed to cross many time zones and date lines to appear on HHH again to talk about the atomic bomb missions. And it will be, of course, we're coming up on the anniversary of that, so it will be very appropriate.
Most appropriate. And I just, as we end the show, I want to give just a shout out to, we lost do you have your glass handy?
I do.
We lost a Ghost Army veteran this week. Arthur Shilstone was 97 years old. He was featured in the Ghost Army documentary. He was a wonderful gentleman, and I've known him now for 14 years, and just very, very close to him. And he's the one who told us the great story and painted the great painting with the Frenchmen on bicycles who see 4 GIs lifting a Sherman tank, and they can't figure out what's going on. And Arthur tells them, well, the Americans are very strong. So that was his story. We miss him, but we can all raise a glass since we're mentioning the Ghost Army and say, Arthur, you lived a wonderful life, on to better places. Great show, Chris. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rick.
And we shall return in a week. Can't wait.
In a week.
Cheers.